Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in another Tuesday discussion of Ayn Rand. Today's essay is for the new intellectual, which is probably the longest essay that Ayn Rand wrote. And it's her. I noticed that your face is a bit. Can you hear me?
You're coming in a little bit stuttered. I'm not sure about your
Okay.
internet connection, Alejandro.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Oh yes, quite clearly now.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that.
That's about okay.
So
Yes.
today's
Okay.
essay is for the new intellectual and problems with it. Let me just start with the first question. So what is the essential question that this essay is trying to answer?
Well, I think you ask it correctly. What is the essential question? As you pointed out, this is a monumental essay. It's one of Ayn Rand's first nonfiction essays after Atlas Shrugged, and it was published in her first nonfiction book on her philosophy called by the same title as this essay for the New Intellectual, and it is an extremely ambitious article. The fundamental theme is the role of ideas in human history, the importance of philosophical ideas as the single most important factor governing and shaping human history. And to do that, she has to review, in effect, what used to be called the history of Western civilization and the history, in particular, of Western philosophy, so that she can track the two. And in so doing, she gives, in effect, objectivism, her philosophy's perspective on history, the role of ideas in history, her ideas about various philosophers. So there's a lot going on in this essay. If you want to know Ayn Rand's view of the major philosophers in Western history, this is a good source. If you want to know her theory of history, this is a good source. If you want an outline of how Ayn Rand approaches the importance of philosophy in life and in history, this is a great source. But it's a monumental essay covering, in effect, the whole of the history of Western civilization and the essential parts of the history of Western philosophy. Nothing short.
Can you hear me now? I'm
Yes, I
just
can.
okay.
Very
Perfect.
well.
Sorry about that. I think my computer is the problem here, not the internet, and it's on its last days. Pro
We're going to have to get you a new
my
computer.
computer. Uh, Thank you. So could you talk a bit more about the setup of the essay? What is the culture of the West today?
Well, yes, that's the point when she comes in and she says, look, here, she was writing in the middle of the 20th century. This book was published in 1961. And at that time, she simply declared outright that America was facing philosophical bankruptcy. And indeed, Western civilization is facing philosophical bankruptcy. And to do that, she shows the desperate plight, in effect, of the West today. Frantically, our intellectuals say no answers are possible, and yet everyone knows that it's an age of moral crisis. Bankruptcy, as she points out, is defined as that state of being at the end of one's resources, and here she means intellectual and cultural resources. The bottom line is that until and unless philosophy gets taken seriously, until and unless we have a philosophy of reason, and in particular one that rejects the doctrine of self-sacrifice and self-immolation called altruism, we can't make progress. In effect, we're still frozen with this ancient primordial idea of human sacrifice that still has not been rejected, even as we have technologically and scientifically made such huge advances. So Ayn Rand posits the idea that today we're meant to run heavy industry and intercontinental ballistic missiles and so forth, using the moral ideas developed thousands of years ago. Yeah, right. And the strange paradox of the current bankruptcy is that, the latest ideas in philosophy, as she pointed out in her time, were Zen Buddhism and existentialism. And when that's the case, when nihilism or ancient mysticism become not to say that there aren't, insights there, but when nihilism and ancient religion become the latest word in philosophy, philosophy is dead. And philosophy really was dead by then in terms of even announcing its own practical ineffectiveness. Today, some 60 years on, things have not changed. They've only gotten worse in this respect. I mean, the exception I'd make to that is the advancement of objectivism and neo-Aristotelian philosophy. But apart from that, we're in a still worse situation, and existentially getting ever worse. Ayn Rand, as usual, was a prophet. With her X-ray vision glasses, she could see where the world was headed, and she would hardly be surprised at the violence on American streets or the increasing authoritarianism, facing Western governments. And she would identify the ultimate cause and the culprit as our philosophical bankruptcy in the West.
So she divides, I think, the essay in two parts. The trend that we're facing right now, which is essentially cultural elevation by the intellectuals. And the other one is an advice for people who want to grab the bulls by the horns.
Right.
But could you address a bit more about this bankruptcy through evasion? Because she talks quite a bit about how she makes a contrast of bankruptcy in this culture. Could you comment a bit more about why she thinks it's bankrupt?
Because, well, as I indicated, philosophy is inescapable, according to Ayn Rand, and the inescapability of philosophy makes it the single most vital area of knowledge that anyone can study, because it tells us whether we're going to think, how we think, what is the status of our knowledge, what is the status of our consciousness's relationship to reality, more than that, what values we should hold and why we should hold them. And those issues will govern and shape everything, from a man's character and emotions to the dominant cultural themes and politics of the time. And philosophy is inescapable. And so what she's talking about here primarily is the evasion of reason, the shutdown of philosophy since Hume and Kant, who in effect shut down the possibility of reason. In this assault on reason, we've reached the point where philosophers will tell you that their task is irrelevant, knowledge is not really possible for human beings, and the answers you seek just aren't there. And if that's the case, then of course we're helpless. And if that's your philosophy, of course, that's going to have emotional manifestations. If that's the dominant idea in the culture, it's going to render us paralyzed and helpless in actually addressing the unique moral issues that have now come to light in the 20th and 21st century. So we are in a state, in effect, of philosophical bankruptcy, which renders us blind and unable to solve the problems of our time.
Can you? She makes a big point on the contrast between modern societies and capital and the pre-capitalist eras. Could you comment on why she makes that point?
Well, in the last 200 or 300 years,
what she'll develop afterwards.
I'm sorry, you were stuttered there, and I thought you'd stopped. I'm sorry. The modern era, the last 200 or 300 years, has seen a radical change in culture in many ways due to the advent of the Industrial Revolution and political freedom. Take music. Just in the short distance between Mozart and Beethoven, Mozart was dependent on royal patronage, rich people funding him. If the Emperor of Austria or if some bishop, of Salzburg didn't fund his art, Mozart couldn't write music. By the time you get to Beethoven, the beginning of the 19th century, Beethoven could make a living selling music, performing, and so we had a professional class of artists, a person who could make his living doing his art. This is true of artists and intellectuals generally. They only came into being as a professional class with the advent of the free market and the Industrial Revolution. They really couldn't earn a living. They were dependent upon patronage in the past, and therefore were dependent upon the motives and biases, and usually kowtowing, or at least limited to the motives and biases of their patrons. The free market literally liberated, in a material sense, intellectuals to be an independent profession, of authors, teachers, speakers, and the professional intellectual really, and just as the professional artist, only came into being with capitalism, freeing them from control by the kings and the mystics who had basically set the agenda before that.
Could you describe the two archetypes that she says are the ruling classes of the time? Could you describe specifically Attila?
Right. Well, there's this, Ayn Rand basically regarded there to be two alternatives to reason. Reason is our only tool of really knowing. Only logical analysis of the evidence of observation can yield true knowledge about reality. There's no magical knowledge. There's two archetypes that come about from the rejection of reason. And this has been the characteristic of human history. And these two archetypes have really characterized human history from the outset. You've got the Attila, he rejects reason, and he's the advocate, he's in effect the thug, who believes that force is an appropriate solution. Violence, force, and the initiation of force, government force, is the appropriate solution to the problems, that it's perfectly okay to do so. He believes, implicitly, that force is really what ultimately controls the world, not the mind. He obviously acts short range because he doesn't see the long range effects of his violence, and he always has to fear, the retaliation, being a user of violence. And so he cannot act long range. He has to be anti-reason. He's acting on the range of the moment, to the perceptual level, mind you. But he believes that force, physical force, is an appropriate means of taking care of situations. He is the Attila. From time immemorial, he is the dictator, the thug, the pharaoh, if you will, who is keeping his Egypt enslaved. And whether it's the pharaoh of Egypt or the king of kings of Persia or the emperor of China, it really doesn't much matter, does it? And so the Attila is the guy who doesn't believe in the power of reason. He believes in the power of muscles. And so Ayn Rand called those people muscle mystics, if you will. Now, as time wore on, they began to have more sophisticated defenses. Might makes right, pragmatism. Hume, in effect, gave voice to this. So it's the philosophically subjectivist side, if you will, of the coin, in a way, the materialist side of this same coin of the rejection of reason. The other archetype she uses, a historical archetype from time immemorial, can be best summarized with the witch doctor, the mystic, who is generally always at the Attila's side and giving the Attila the philosophical justifications for what he's doing. He too rejects reason. He goes by emotion and its various forms, mystic revelation, you name it, whatever the details of his own mysticism. He is the intrinsicist. You see, the two sides of both epistemology and ethics that Ayn Rand rejected, two sides of the same coin of rejecting reason. One is, to believe that somehow emotions get me plugged into universal values that that are not accessible to reason. That's your witch doctor. And the Attila is the guy who believes that reason doesn't work. The only thing that really matters in the end is force. But they're really both rejections of reason. And in effect, you see, they're really two sides of the same psychological coin. One believes that the mind is what controls things, right? We can't escape philosophy, and yet he's rejected reason. The other, if you will, so he's reduced to emotions and mystical thought. But he controls this realm that the Attila doesn't really appreciate or understand. He thinks it's the mind part that he hasn't really grasped. It's the physical part. He's really split himself in two, just as the witch doctor has. And so they sort of need each other to complete each other, but they don't really ever complete each other at all. They're just two sides of the same coin. For the Attila, it's, of course, everything that the witch doctor thinks he needs. He's helpless in the face of physical reality. He wants someone to go out there and wield the sword for him, right? They're both, in effect, dependents upon other people who have rejected reason, One, the witch doctor wants to control the mind, the soul, the emotions, especially of the Attila. The Attila wants to control your body, thinks your stomach is all that matters, and that his muscles are all that matters, and therefore he's cut off from the mind. He needs the witch doctor, and the witch doctor sort of needs the Attila, because they've both cut themselves in two between mind and body, theory and practice, and yet they still sort of need each other to complete each other, knowing that that's sort of representing the other half that they're missing.
You comment on the idea of they don't want to exert any effort.
Oh, well, yes. What the thing is, they're both in opposition to the challenges of reality. See, reality poses a challenge. Life is a struggle. Nothing is automatic. To feed ourselves takes effort and thought. Every value takes effort to bring into existence. The producer is the person who applies reason to the problem of survival in a direct way, altering the world in effect around him so that it's more amenable to human survival and happiness. The producer is the third alternative, the man of reason, if you will, the man who does not reject reason and is not either a muscle mystic or a mystic of spirit. The producer is the guy, again, the professional who came into existence in effect with the Industrial Revolution. Not just the businessman, but the intellectual and the artist came into being as the defenders in effect of reason, who are producing values, actual values. They have no need for either the Attila or the witch doctor. In fact, the restriction on their freedom is destructive of their efforts. Freedom is what they need to function. This is why a culture with a censorship must be stagnant. The artists and the intellectuals are not free, their mind is not free, and reason is shut down in effect. In the material sense, when I'm not allowed to be free economically, then of course my mind, when it comes to material matters, is shut down. And when it comes to surviving and technology and business, that's shut down in terms of the mind. The producer is the antipode, if you will, to the Attila, just as the professional intellectual, the rational philosopher or artist is the antipode to the witch doctor in a rational society. And it is really only in the last 200 or 300 years that that's even emerged in contrast to the Attila and the witch doctor, to create an alternative, to make clear the alternative. But it is a rejection of reason. These people are parasites. These people seek to avoid the effort of existence. They want an automatic form of existence. Just as the mystic, the witch doctor, he doesn't want to go by logic and observation and all that work of science and oh my gosh, he wants automatic knowledge. And so he pretends that there is such a thing. That's what mysticism is. It's a magical form of knowledge, a causeless form of knowledge. I just had a revelation, or a Ouija board, or a horoscope. Whatever his variant of mysticism is, it's an automatic form of knowledge that he's seeking to evade the effort of reason, which is a lot of effort. Knowledge is the product of an intense achievement, sometimes a very hard achievement. The Attila is clear. He doesn't want to produce. In fact, in the medieval ages, anyone who was a farmer or a tradesman or a manufacturer, he was looked down on as some kind of lowly material, whereas the nobleman who controlled things by the sword, he had the titles and the coats of arms, and he was noble, you see. Because he was the best at being brutal, he won the competition of savagery, he is somehow the king. Okay, so he looks down on rational, productive effort. They are the lowly, what did Napoleon call England? A country of bankers and clerks. Well, that country of bankers and clerks defeated him, very much so. But you see, the men like Napoleon really have contempt for rational producers. They want an effortless existence, but that requires that they rule producers, that they rule men physically. But whether you choose to rule men through physical force, like the Attilas of history, or you're a mystic who's seeking some magical knowledge of the other side, both are evading the effort that life actually demands and requires. And it's that evasion that requires them to rule people It's not the conquest of nature or the conquest of understanding of their own processes of consciousness that they're after. No, no, no. They don't want knowledge and they don't want success, right? That's not what they want. They want and need to control the producer, the rational person. They dare never name the virtue of the people that they're really dependent upon, but they're really parasites.
Let me thank Bernardo and Carolina for her contributions. Some pesos.
Thank you.
To the chat. So let's plunge into the history of like specific part of history. Could you talk about what was the first glimpse of freedom in man's history, and why was the witch doctor then retracting?
Oh, well, science and philosophy were born in ancient classical Greece some 2,400 years ago. It was a radical change in the status of the human mind. Suddenly science, scientific naturalistic explanations like those of Thales, and Democritus and Empedocles were replacing divine explanations, magical explanations. The gods did it. And so science was born and beginning to be born. Mathematics was beginning to be born. And of course, philosophy was born. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and this created a self-conscious discipline that we now know as philosophy, which would change and shape the world thereafter, without any doubt. Now, how did that happen? How did that come into being? Well, Ayn Rand didn't have time to get in here, but it really was freedom. It really was a kind of independence where these seaborne merchants and traders on the islands of Greece and the tiny little rocky peninsulas of Greece. Greece was so geographically mixed up that in the ancient world, all they really were was independent city-states. And it was almost impossible. They could never really get together precisely because of this geographical position. But it granted each of those city-states sort of a competitive independence with one another. And so the geography of Greece, I would say, contributed directly to the sort of independence and freedom that it had. It had trade and exposure to the ancient civilizations like Egypt, right, and those in the Near East, and yet it had sort of an independent approach to thinking because of the political diversity within Greece. And that freedom, that comparative freedom, opened this possibility up and gave the West the first glimpse of how the relationship first between reason and freedom, but it also allowed the witch doctor to recede far enough into the past. He was in effect powerless. Freedom renders these guys powerless. And so as the witch doctor recedes, reason actually has a space to grow. And that is exactly what happened in ancient Greece and the scientific and philosophical revolution that happened in ancient Greece.
And could you talk a bit more about what happened to Attila? I mean, just in Greece, because we will talk about Rome later, but what happened to Attila? For instance, who was Pericles? Is that his name in English? Sorry.
Right. Pericles was sort of ran Athens. He was the guy that commissioned the Parthenon. He hung out with Socrates and Sophocles, right? He was part of this culture. And he was, in effect, not, the first time you've got something other than, not maybe the first time entirely, but one of the first times you got someone other than just a rank thug, someone who appreciates the role of the mind. As I say, it was a political, look at what Athens had. It was a democracy for a while, rank democracy without a lot of limits that could do bad things. But still, they were coming along this society of seaborne merchants who had comparative political independence from one another, were developing with this freedom an understanding of an implicit understanding between the relationship between freedom and thought.
And could you comment a bit more about what is the significance of Aristotle in this period?
Oh boy, we could do an entire talk just on the significance of Aristotle here. As Ayn Rand points out, a student of Plato, he had the advantage of the implicit logical training of the Socratic school, but What he did was radically different. He started to systematize logic. Before Aristotle, if you said, "Oh, you were committing a logical fallacy there," "Oh, that's a good argument. That deductively is sound," you couldn't have said that. That didn't exist. Logic had not been self-consciously discovered at all. Were people using logic to discover things? Oh, sure, people have been speaking prose without knowing it, too, for a long time. Sure, if they were going to solve problems, they did so logically. But because it wasn't an explicit doctrine, as Aristotle gave us, of how to know, Aristotle was the one who said, to know, you must look. Knowledge all begins and arises from observation. He is the father of science, all science. It is hardly surprising that he is also the father of several specific sciences. He was by far the best observational biologist of the ancient world, at least up until that point, by far. He was the first scientific comparative political scientist. He developed, in effect, comparative literary analysis, various sciences of that kind. So it was the birth of self-conscious science. Aristotle is the father of observational science and logic. This was the liberation of the mind. This was the beginning of the human capacity to self-consciously know that whether their method of achieving knowledge about reality was valid or not. A revolution. It cannot be overstated. It really cannot be overstated, the impact of Aristotle. And from that point on, you can measure in Western civilization the ups and downs by the influence of Aristotle, quite directly. The greater the influence of Aristotle, the more rational the period. The less the influence of Aristotle, the darker the age.
And let's talk more about the Hellenistic and Roman eras. Could you comment a bit more on those, and then why did they crumble?
Well, I think that the primary reason is, unfortunately, that Platonism and Neoplatonism had an upper hand. I think that Aristotle had students, and there was Aristotelian schools that followed him in the Hellenistic period, and there were admirers of Aristotle even in the Roman world. Cicero, for example, a huge admirer, called Aristotle's dialogues, none of which survived to the modern world anyway, more beautiful than Plato's. Liquid gold, verbal gold, really what he thought very highly. Yeah, were Aristotelian thinkers in the Hellenistic and early Roman periods, but Plato definitely still had the upper hand. And when this political independence of the ancient Greek city-states fell apart, then the political freedom, the comparative political freedom of Greece fell apart. And that fell apart when the Macedonians basically took control of all of Greece and conquered, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. And that turned the Middle East, had the positive effect of spreading Greek ideas all over the ancient world. Egypt and Syria were now run by Greek kings who brought Greek culture in and integrated it with the wider Middle East. So it had the effect of spreading Greek culture, but it also had the effect of bringing political oppression and authoritarianism over Greece and parts of the ancient world, which sort of squelched in my view, the political freedom that sort of was the oxygen that fed the Greek Revolution. So between the rise of the neo-mysticism of Platonic dualism and the end of political freedom in the Hellenistic world, things started going back down. And you can measure the downward spiral all the way from the Hellenistic period to the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, which became a welfare warfare state, and mysticism by that point, neo-mysticism and Neoplatonism, was definitely taking over the ancient world by that point. So as political situation became more authoritarian over time, the neo-mysticism and Neoplatonism definitely took over more and more, and that is what destroyed the Roman Empire.
I know that you're an expert on this area. I don't know if you wanted to mention something else about this period, or that you think could fit.
Well, what took over, unfortunately, from classical Greek ideas in their dominance in the Greco-Roman world was Christianity. And Christianity was a particularly consistent and virulent form of Neoplatonic dualism and mysticism. And the Christianity that Edward Gibbon said in his famous book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was the fundamental cause of the destruction of classical civilization, really gained steam here. But don't be deceived. Christianity is a virulent form of, especially at the time, a virulent form of mysticism and Neoplatonism. I would just point out that when we talk about Christianity governing the Dark Ages, what we're talking about is Platonism and Neoplatonism and mysticism governing the era. A real era in which reason was utterly, utterly sidelined. And we had during the Dark Ages, there were practically no, there were some innovations. There were some great writers, monks, in some of these isolated monasteries. There was some technological development, particularly towards the end of the beginning of the Middle Ages, but it was slow. There were no great scientific advances. There were no great philosophic advances. And politically, in the West, Western Europe had fallen apart. The Western Roman Empire became political chaos. Were thugs, basically, barbarians who were used by the Romans to defend their borders, by the way, would invade Rome, be impressed by the superior Roman culture they came to. I mean, the Franks who invaded France and the Visigoths who invaded Spain basically adopted Roman culture, Roman religion, Christianity, Roman language, Latin, which the French and the Spanish still speak versions of. So these barbarians come in and become Romanized, in effect. And at that time, that meant Christianized, and deeply Christianized. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued for a while, but it engaged in what I describe as a self-inflicted lobotomy. They destroyed. You cannot find Aristotle's, most of his books on poetry, on the poetics, his tragedy, his epic, lost to the West. His dialogues, as I lost to the West. Archimedes, maybe the greatest physical scientist of the ancient world, maybe the greatest scientist of the ancient world after Aristotle, his book on method was completely lost. We only know about it in palimpsest form now. They bleached it out and put another Christian prayer book on top of it, rather than preserve and copy Archimedes' scientific method. So no, as the Byzantine Empire sort of was shrinking over centuries and declining, it was becoming more and more virulently mystical through the course of that, with their debates over whether you could even depict in icons and stuff. But it was a self-inflicted lobotomy. The Dark Ages were dark on principle.
You correct me if I'm wrong. I think she has an interesting view of dividing the Dark and Middle Ages, which when I was taught history, I was taught that the Middle and the Dark Ages were the same thing. But if I correctly understand what she's thinking, is that the Dark Ages is a very specific period when Rome falls. And then there's the Middle Ages when Christianity is taking over.
Oh, no. The Dark Ages, Christianity was in full rule, and in a sense, in a stronger rule. Middle Ages started to see a little bit of loosening. In the Dark Ages, there were places in Europe where you would be killed if you were found with and your book would be destroyed if you were found with a copy of a book by Aristotle. It was a capital offense. The book would be destroyed. Certain knowledge was forbidden. If you were a variant Christian, you'd be executed. During the Dark Ages, they were wiping out paganism, wiping out variant forms of Christianity by crusade, in effect. No, the Dark Ages was when Christianity really ruled. The Middle Ages, we began to see a loosening up of Christian rule. And what do I mean by that? Of course, Christianity, the Middle Ages was the time. Now, consider this. The Middle Ages were the time when the great castles and cathedrals were built. Before this period, you basically have wood forts and wood huts in Western Europe. I'm not exaggerating. The great castles and the stuff, the cathedrals come out. The 1200s, the 13th century was the time of Thomas Aquinas. His teacher, Albertus Magnus, was the first to really reintroduce Aristotle into the West. It became okay now to read Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas systematically revised Christian philosophy and theology in light of Aristotle's logic, a revolution in thought. There were other medieval thinkers who were introducing logic, Greek ideas about this time. The 1200s saw the founding of the University of Paris and the founding of the Oxford University, the oldest universities in Western Europe. The streets of Paris became paved. The Magna Carta happened in the 1200s. No, the Middle Ages was a dramatic step forward. Some people attribute this to weather, the warming, and that may have indeed played a role, but the really vital role was the infusion of Greek ideas. When the Crusades happened, when people from Western Europe, particularly France and Northern Italy and England, came over and to conquer the Holy Land, the Byzantines had lost control of the Holy Land, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, to the Muslims. And to protect the Christian pilgrim way there, Catholics from Western Europe came and did the Crusades, and for a century ran a Catholic kingdom of Jerusalem in the Middle East, for example. Well, this foray into the Middle East exposed them to Muslim ideas, to Byzantine ideas, to ideas that had been, in effect, long forgotten in the Latin-speaking West, as Greek was forgotten, for example. And it was that made a huge difference. And people most especially like Thomas Aquinas, in the reintroduction of Aristotle into the West, transformed the West. People have called the 13th century, for good reason, the magnificent century, and it's the medieval period, an important period of transition from the Dark Ages to the Renaissance.
Could you comment a bit more on Thomas Aquinas as a figure?
Right. Thomas Aquinas, well, he, more than any philosopher of the medieval period, gave us a systematic defense of Aristotle, at least within the confines of his own Christian understanding. Take, for example, the idea of self-defense. Simple, livable self-defense. Jesus had said, according to the New Testament, turn the other cheek, submit to the evildoer, love your enemy, blessed are you when you're persecuted, pick up your own cross and follow me, sacrifice, surrender, surrender. Well, turn the other cheek is a literal doctrine. And Augustine, for example, St. Augustine, writing his book, City of God and the Confessions, was quite clear. Even if someone's attacking you with a knife and coming immediately at you saying, I'm going to kill you, Alejandro, you can't kill him. You can't use force back, even in reasonable self-defense. When Jesus said turn the other cheek, he meant it. That even when you can defend yourself, and even if you're subjected to irrational, unjustified, violent attack, you cannot defend. You have to sit there and take it. Now, Augustine knew most people couldn't live up to this. The people would try to defend themselves when they could, but that's a sin. You'd have to go to confession and say, I fought back. I didn't turn the other cheek. Well, that ruled Christianity until Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas, for the first time, allowed Christians, for example, just to give you one example of how he made it more earthly, more reasonable, more livable. But of course, he couldn't cite the words of Jesus. He could cite Aristotle. He could cite natural law. He could observe using Aristotle's method. He said, look around, look at other cultures, look at animals. It is reasonable to defend yourself if you don't live, so long as you're not doing it out of some vindictive, malicious vengeance. But of course, even Aquinas said that the clergy still had to sort of suck it up and take it if they were attacked, because they have to act like the apostles, and that's what Jesus meant by turn the other cheek. So just right there you can see. But deeper than that, Thomas Aquinas reintroduced an entire method that would start having more and more influence on the West. By the 14 and 1500s, especially the 1500s, by the 16th century, Aristotle was the dominant ideology ruling Europe by that point. And we call it the Renaissance.
Could you talk a bit more about the Renaissance? And maybe I have a little question to that, a connected question to that, and that is, why she's not making that big of a deal about the Enlightenment? She doesn't mention it that much here. Does she consider the Enlightenment as a part of the Renaissance inertia?
Yes. Well, the Enlightenment, let's put the Enlightenment to one side. The Renaissance, the significance of the Renaissance cannot be underestimated. It was more than, it was far more important than just a narrow little view of logic at all. It was a whole new view of life on earth. Look, for example, at the humanistic poetry that came about with Petrarch and Boccaccio. No more do we have these metaphysical religious poems like Dante's, Divine Comedy, which are really just an epic poem to explain Christian Catholic metaphysics. No, we have romantic poems about love and life on earth, and secular themes now entering into poetry. Or take Da Vinci's art. The Renaissance art now has three dimensions, now has perspective. Now, a new kind of realism enters it representationally. Baby Jesuses that need beards start disappearing with these flat, iconic stuff that they called art before. And so it was a love of this world, a love of observation. Look at Da Vinci's love of observation, his studies of the flight of birds, his dissection of the human body, his drawings of the human body, which are still used to teach medical students anatomy. No. A love of this world, a love of observation, a love of a new personal portraits were being drawn, not just portraits of religious subjects. The Renaissance turned the Christian world into a secular world, a world focused on this world, not the next. And that is really what characterized at least the politics of the Dark and Middle Ages. The Renaissance blasted, in effect, the Attila off his throne, if you will. Now, the Renaissance still had Attilas, but they were in retreat against the power of the new rational method that was coming in. And that slow retreat means the slow retreat of religion. The mystics, the witch doctors too, were sort of thrown off balance by the introduction of Aristotle. They too were in slow retreat as science gains. And so the 1500s sees Copernicus and Kepler, the laws of planetary motion, and a better understanding, despite the Catholic view of the Earth-centered universe, a better understanding of science comes in. A better understanding of medicine starts coming in the 1500s, until you begin to have, at the start of the 1600s, Galileo. And then by the 1600s, you've got Boyle and Newton and Huygens, and a whole scientific revolution underway by the 1600s. Descartes develops analytic geometry, and analytic geometry with Galileo's started physics, with Kepler's laws of planetary motion, are what gives rise to Newton, the climax of this age of science, where in effect you could have a system of physics for the first time, so objective it can be stated in mathematics. Yeah, the Enlightenment was an enormous achievement. The science of Newton happened at about the same time as the political science, the political philosophy of John Locke. And here you've got a serious philosopher who is making huge headway among the intellectuals in France and England and Holland about rights, about how slavery is wrong, how kings don't have some special divine right, how individuals have the right to the product of their own labor, the fruits of their own labor, private property, free speech, no slavery, individual rights. And that body of ideas, now it had been developing for about a century since Hugo Grotius, but it was another climax of the Enlightenment. But they were in effect the climax of Aristotle's influence. Even as some of these people were critics of Aristotle, Aristotle made some mistakes, but they were also sometimes wrongly methodological critics of Aristotle. Nonetheless, Locke brought empiricism to know we must observe, just as Aristotle said. Man is born tabula rasa, without any innate knowledge. He may have innate things, but he doesn't have innate knowledge. And as Aristotle said, and it was an application of reason and natural law, Thomistic, Thomas Aquinas natural law, to human rights. That's what gave us Locke. So, and then of course Locke had such an influence on British and American political thinking thereafter. You wouldn't have had Thomas Jefferson or John Stuart Mill, and the emergence of the liberal state in the modern times, the emergence, if you will, of the professional businessman and the professional intellectual. If it weren't for that, the triumph, in effect, of Aristotle. But by the time you get to the 18th century, it becomes a mixed bag. By the late Enlightenment, you do have thinkers that are really, really starting to challenge this triumph of reason. And that's what they were doing, challenging the triumph of reason. Rousseau's Back to Nature. Still worse, Hume's belief that causality can't be known, substance can't be known. his, in effect, significant attack on reason as such. How do we know the sun will rise tomorrow? It's just really kind of sheer luck that the sun will rise tomorrow. There's no little necessity flag that comes out that says, oh yeah, I've got to rise again tomorrow. So Hume was an attack, sort of a defense, and this is the way Ayn Rand puts it for the New Intellectual. Here is the voice of Attila getting philosophical voice. Getting philosophical voice. Reason doesn't matter. Emotions are what matter. At the end of the day, it's might and emotions that control things. So we have the emergence, the reemergence of muscle mysticism. The mystics of the witch doctory was starting to come about too, even as early as Descartes. And he was a great scientist, the father of analytic geometry. But his attempt to defend God and his version of Christianity was the reinsertion of witch doctory as an idea back into Western thought. And that really reached its climax with the most important figure who turned around this post-Aquinas rise of the West, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant set out at the end of the 18th century, the end of the 1700s, we can call it the end of the Enlightenment, because he was the one who put the period on the Enlightenment, as far as I'm concerned, by specifically defending the religious approach to morality. He specifically wanted to, it wasn't Christianity's details that he was defending, but the broad religious worldview of Christianity. Ethics, a mystic-based ethics of duty that had nothing to do with this world. An assault on reason. And reason, again, the thing that unites them all is this assault on reason. The assault on the ability of humanity to know anything by means of observation and Aristotelian logic. And that, according to Ayn Rand, was the beginning of the end. Although materially, technologically, the 19th century was the most spectacular century perhaps in human history. Slavery was getting wiped off the face of the civilized world, at least in the minds of civilized people. Slavery was becoming unlawful. For the first time, rights were thought to extend to women. No kidding. Free trade was starting to take over the world. Britain, sort of, with its dominance, sort of oversaw almost a century of peace in Europe, unprecedented since the fall of Rome in the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution created with the development of mass production, the steam engine, railroads, revolutionized economic productivity. Later on, there were American inventions like the light bulb and the telephone and the airplane, again, or Henry Ford's automated assembly line, revolutionized productivity. And so as humans were making this giant advance in wealth and well-being, as you know, before this time, you've got a few teeny percentage of rulers at the top, and 99+% of the population was on the verge of famine at all times in desperate poverty. What happened in the 19th century was the emergence of a large middle class in those places that did have relative freedom, like Great Britain and the United States. And so capitalism is characterized by an emergence of a large middle class. They become the bulk of the population, a population which radically grows in an unprecedented way. So as the 19th century was seeing huge strides in politics, technology, science, culture, even as that was going on and the effect of the Enlightenment was still having its positive impact that way, culturally speaking, there was that all was being undermined. The rank Attilaism of Marx or the rank witch doctory of Hegel were now the dominant ideas in German, in Central European philosophy. Kant had liberated, in effect, the Attilas and the witch doctors to come back in more sophisticated form, the intrinsicists and the subjectivists, the materialists and the idealists, the dichotomies that Ayn Rand rejected, but saw as manifestations of a rejection of reason, two sides of the same coin, both rejecting objectivity. And so here you have Ayn Rand implicitly, in effect, giving us an understanding of her distinct view, objectivity, as opposed to either muscle mysticism or mysticism of the spirit.
Could you comment a bit more on the kind of archetypes that replace Attila and the witch doctor in the advent of the Industrial Revolution?
Well, exactly. Well, Ayn Rand was keen to point out that for the first time, artists and intellectuals became professionals, liberated from the need for patronage from some king or some bishop, some Attila or some witch doctor who had to be their patron. So now you've got the professional intellectual coming into being for the first time, just as you have the producer. And this is really the broader concept here, whether it's in the world of art and ideas or whether it's in the world of material production and business. The producer is the person of reason who's applying reason to these issues, to the problems of survival. And that is the contrast here. So you've got the businessman and you've got the intellectual. And the intellectual should kind of be the bodyguard for the businessman. The division of labor is such the businessman's out there doing his thing, liberating humanity, allowing the progress of humanity in a material way. He depends upon a defense from intellectuals. And unfortunately, in the post-Kantian world, the intellectuals completely failed the producers. The businessmen and the intellectuals who should have been their bodyguard, the professional artists and intellectuals who should have been their bodyguards, but failed in that duty, still trapped by the neo-mysticism of the post-Kantian world, still trapped, you see, with this false dichotomy of Attila versus the witch doctor.
And since we're running a bit of time, let me go to the second part of the...
We could do 3 more on this monumental essay.
Yes.
Ayn Rand's achievements and literary statements in this are absolutely brilliant. We'll find here her brilliant attack on Kant, blind because we have eyes, deaf because we have ears, deluded because we have a mind. A brilliant summary of Kant's epistemology. So many others like that, just like the Attila and the witch doctor. And you can't really substitute it by doing anything but reading this very long but very important monumental essay.
Exactly. So we have 2 super chat questions related to the first part, and the first one is of Jean. He asked, how does Aristotle originally gain popularity in the Greek culture?
Well, it's a funny thing is that Aristotle, the intellectual, had a status in ancient Greek culture just as such. He had a status in ancient Greek culture just as such that you didn't find in any other culture at that point. Aristotle attended Plato's academy. He was considered the nous in Greek, the active intellect, the brain, if you will. He was considered the brainy nerd of Plato among Plato's students. And so he was really smart, and he had a powerful system. So he was a highly respected student of Plato's in a culture that respected thinkers. Rich parents would send their kids to Plato's academy. Aristotle also had a powerful influence because he was hired by the king of Macedonia. He was probably related to the family of the physicians of the kings of Macedonia, and was Macedonian himself. And he was hired by the king of Macedonia to teach his son, who turned out to be Alexander the Great. So there were a couple of really good reasons. First, the power of Aristotle's thought. I mean, he is the most famous of Plato's students because he was probably the most important in terms of the revolution of his thought. And so just the truth of his thought and the power of his thought, the systematic application of his method across various fields made Aristotle, his genius, well-known and highly admired in that culture. But he was also the #1 student at Plato's academy. He was also the teacher of Alexander the Great, who conquered the ancient world. So for various reasons, Aristotle had a tremendous influence. But as I say, as time wore on, his influence waned, and Aristotle and Plato's and Neoplatonism's very much took over.
And the other question is from Gail. She's asking, is it astonishing to me the enormous influences certain individual intellectuals had in the medieval period? Do you think an individual could spread broad similar influence today?
There's a very interesting question there, because the church did control the official ideology. And if you're thinking straight too far outside of church thinking, you were in trouble. You could get tortured and burnt at the stake, no less. So the church really controlled ideas. And when the church decided that Aristotle and some Greek ideas could be taught, and in fact could even be integrated with Christianity, they were letting in a Trojan horse. And because it was led by monks and some of the smartest minds in the Catholic Church in the late Middle Ages, it had an impact that would be disproportionate than if there were, various other sources. On the other hand, freedom is the best way for true ideas to get through. And so, while on the one hand, it coming from official Catholic sources was enormously helpful in Aristotle's influence gaining traction. On the other hand, I think that traction would have been far greater had there been in its wake freedom, so that people could really understand it. We might have been able to avoid some of the misunderstandings of Aristotle that occurred in the 16 and 1700s.
Thank you. So let me go to the second part of the essay, and that is, what is the solution to today's state? What is the solution to intellectuals becoming witch doctors? Or in essence, how can we become new intellectuals?
Well, Ayn Rand sets the minimum at the end of the essay, the minimum requirements for a civilized society. And they are, of course, the direct opposition to the basic ideas of the Attila and the witch doctor. The witch doctor must be dethroned by, one, the rejection of emotions as tools of cognition, the rejection of emotions as givens in human cognition. Emotions are not our guide. Our emotions are the product of our evaluations. Ayn Rand had a revolutionary theory of psychology and where emotions come from, one that's pretty much gained ascendancy in recent decades. But she understood that emotions in themselves are not a source of knowledge like the mystics would have us believe. And that's what it really comes down to for a mystic, is emotions. Whether it's tea leaves, Ouija boards, horoscopes, it comes down to I feel this. So feelings as a tool of cognition has to be rejected as a basic minimum, one. And two, equally important, the Attila's basic premise that the initiation of force is permissible, ever permissible, that force and violence are ever valid solutions to social problems, has to be rejected. And without those two minimums, we can't return to reason. Reason will neither have the freedom nor the ability to create a new intellectual. And that's where the new intellectuals Ayn Rand sees coming from. And the role of philosophy is particularly important here. I think there are other conditions. We have to reject the philosophy of Kant and Hume and pull the plugs on it, if you will, systematically. And for that, there is no substitute but the philosopher. The philosopher, in effect, is the commander-in-chief of the intellectuals and the businessmen in a free society, and should be defending them, and should be defending reason, and defending a non-violent, a world without force. And those are the minimum conditions. And for those Ayn Rands who take up this cause, the cause of reason and freedom, as opposed to the primordial causes of faith and force, they are the ones future civilization will depend upon and need.
Thank you very much, James. I think this was the last question that I had, unless you have something else to comment on this essay.
No, I have to say that this is one of the most powerfully influential things that Ayn Rand ever wrote on me. My interest in history was stimulated, perhaps more than by reading anything else that I've ever read, by this essay. It taught me the power of ideas, the importance of ideas. And so for me as a historian, it is the power of something like Christianity or Neoplatonism that causes me to, just in terms of my own selfish personal work, but you can see how it could affect philosophers, historians, humanities across the board. Ayn Rand understood the role of ideas in human history and understood the importance of the field of history like no other thinker before her.
Thank you. So thank you very much, James. I really much appreciate this kind of talk with you.
Well, thank
Sorry
you.
about that
Oh no,
Wi-Fi issue.
it all cleared
Um,
up pretty quickly.
yes, it was. I have a tech guy here
Oh,
helping me.
that's good. It's always good to have a tech guy.
But and I think that the audience also appreciates that. I thank Gail, I thank Robert, I thank Jean, Carolina, and Bernardo for their super chats. I think they're a response of how much they value these discussions with you, James. To the audience, if you want to contribute to these discussions, if you want to continue them going, please become a member of the Iron Center UK. The link should be below the video. There are memberships starting on £10 a month. Is not that much
No,
money, and there are a lot
great
of perks.
benefit. Yeah.
Exactly. Can you talk a bit more about the perks,
Well,
James?
yeah, we do workshops on Leonard Peikoff. For example, we do workshops every weekend on Leonard Peikoff's lecture courses, and we're going to be starting Understanding Objectivism, a new course this Sunday. So if you subscribe this week, you'll be able to participate. And that's one of the cool things in this workshop. You can really participate and ask questions of me and Nikos, and we talk about that. This Friday, we're going to continue our discussions of Leonard Peikoff essays and talks. I think Lisa Van Dam will join us on Friday. There's, and what you're doing is you're helping really one of the most important projects going on in the world today, the spread of Ayn Rand's ideas internationally, with the Daily Objective, with all these different projects that we do, communication with Don Watkins, all these different projects that the Ayn Rand Center UK does. You are instrumental in doing the most important work of new intellectuals, if I can bring it back to the essay.
Definitely. There are very few people doing objectivism in the international sphere, and certainly the Ayn Center UK is one of the few going forward in that sense. So with that being said, thank you very much again, James, and see you next Tuesday.
Right. Thank you.